we've long been advocates of the necessity to leave the UN Refugee Convention, which was set up in 1951. And we believe that if we did that, then that would open up a whole range of options which we presently don't have to deal with the huge numbers of people who are coming in essentially illegally. Although technically it's legal within the UN Refugee Convention, they are basically, to all intents and purposes, appearing to the rest of us as illegal. And so if we did that, we would need something to replace it. And so we've written this 6,500 word document, which is a 25-minute read, by the way. So this is for the hardcore. This is for the hardcore here. But let me just summarize it. Here we go. The goals of the program, the definitions, our 10 core principles, or rather our 10 core proposals, how we deal with those who arrive outside of what we are suggesting should be an asylum visa system, how to deal with those whose claims are indeed being considered, whether or not we should allow asylum appeals, our new status for people who are granted refugee status called contingent refugee leave to remain, and part 6 here, some considerations for the actual border force themselves. So we put this together in a very logical, very thoughtful way, and we say it ourselves, but we've never read anything like this anywhere before. Much that's been written before is looking at how does Britain deal with the refugee crisis within the boundaries of the UN Refugee Convention. And as we've pointed out, it's extremely difficult to get a handle on it, is so long as you remain within that convention, because that convention was never intended as a way to move economic migrants around the world. It was never intended as a way for people who are suffering some kind of misfortune to be able to claim asylum in other countries. It was really only ever intended, initially, it was only intended to try to sort out the chaos after World War II. And then in 1967, it was already out of date, but everybody had signed up to it and they kept it on the books and they amended it to refer not just to the people who were suffering as a consequence of World War II, but essentially to amend it to every nation and every place in the world. That was called the 1967 Protocol. It was all unnecessary. It was all out of date, but we're still stuck with this in the age now of mass travel and communication and transportation. The UN Refugee Convention is simply a way that undermines the safety and security and especially the sovereignty of our national borders and indeed every nation's national borders. And it really is no longer fit for purpose. The thing is, though, it is a core law of the post-war legal structure. Every nation is signed up to it, and to overturn it, or rather just simply to leave it, would be a revolutionary act. And it's not something that, for example, Keir Starmer's government will be doing in the next 3 or 4 years, but it's definitely something that we need to start a conversation upon, because the UN Refugee Convention at the moment is being used for things which it was never intended to be used for. It's being used now as simply a backdoor way of getting people into the country outside of the proper legal channels. So we recognize all of that in this. We explain how the UN Refugee Convention works. We start with our definitions of what an asylum seeker is compared to what a refugee is. And we start with our core proposals, which firstly is leaving the UN Convention. And then when we've done that, people who enter the country illegally will be free to be disciplined, as it were, will be free to be put in prison if necessary. Because at the moment, If somebody enters illegally and claims refugee status, we do have to take them seriously. Whereas if we leave, we'll no longer be bound by that requirement. We'll be able to have an actual deterrent, which will be prison. At the moment, if we declare somebody's asylum claim nonsense and inadmissible, we still cannot send them back without an investigation which proves otherwise. So that again is just simply a way that these people are able to stay in the country. So that has to end as well, and that will end when we leave the UN Refugee Convention. Now, a lot of people think it's the ECHR which prevents us um, deporting people. It's not actually. It's the UN Refugee Convention. As we say here, it is primarily the UN Refugee Convention which opens the door into the country in the first place, and it is the UN Refugee Convention which is the main reason we're prevented from deporting clearly fraudulent, inadmissible asylum seekers, as per the explanation which we've given in the above paragraphs. However, the ECHR does kick in for a far fewer number who don't want to leave and who can make a claim under family life. And that's usually because they've been in the country long enough to actually start a family life. And as we're saying here, if our proposals are brought in, most of these people will not actually be in the country long enough to start a family life. And so we'll probably largely solve that problem in itself just by our new proposals.